Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first in this series of webinars on implementation of evidence-based ideas. I'm Matt Bland. I'm from the Society of Evidence-Based Policing. We're going to be trying to put on one of these once a month where we talk to people who've actually been there and done it with some evidence-based ideas. Today, we're talking about deferred prosecution. Hopefully, you all know that because that's why you're here. My co-host, Suzanne Carnarvon-Nicole, is going to lead the introductions for the panels, and then I'll talk you through the format after everybody's had the chance to introduce themselves.
Well, hello again, and also welcome from me to the to this fantastic, hopefully live webinar. We will ask you to put in some questions that you've got for the panel in wherever you're watching. So you're probably either watching on YouTube or LinkedIn. Just comment where you see this post and just start with the queue if you could, and then I'll pick that up later and we'll go through the questions. So we will first speak to our panel for the first part of the session, and then later we'll go to your questions, the audience. So just put your questions in there and we will get to them. So if I can just ask the panel to introduce themselves. First of all, Sarah Carlson-Brown, please.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Sarah Carlson-Brown. I work for Devon and Cornwall Police as Senior Manager for Reducing Reoffending.
Thank you. And next I've got Anna Baker.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Anna Baker. I'm the Checkpoint Cymru Manager, Deferred Prosecution Scheme up in sunny North Wales.
Thank you. Emily Sprague.
Hi, my name is Emily Sprague. I also work at Devon and Cornwall Police as the Out of Court Resolutions Team Manager.
And Katie Harbour. You're muted, Katie. It had to happen to someone. It had to happen to someone. No?
Because you mute, I was told to mute.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, everyone. I'm Katie Harbour, Detective Super in the Met on our Strategic Insight Unit. But prior to that, I was running the Turning Point London trial of deferred prosecution run as a randomised control trial. Thanks.
Excellent. And can we now briefly go through the round again? And very briefly, can everyone say what deferred prosecution is like in your neck of the woods, how it's working? Just a minute or so each, please. Let's start with Sarah.
Yes, hi. So we've been running a deferred prosecution scheme since 2017, starting with deferred caution and then operating deferred charge from 2019. We operate a police staff key worker model. So the key workers are employed obviously by Devon and Cornwall Police, but work really in an outreach capacity. So liaising both with the front line and with officers, but also working intensively with participants that come onto the scheme and liaising and brokering with partners. And that's essentially the model. And Emily, you can add some more details. Thank you.
Yeah, so as Sarah said, we run deferred charges and deferred cautions at present, and all of those are run through one-to-one key worker models. They come from officers through to an evidence review officer who reviews whether they're appropriate for an out-of-court resolution. They go through an eligibility check, and then they are allocated to our key workers who hold that file and do all of the interventions for a 16-week period. They breach or complete someone at the end of that 16 weeks, depending on if they've fulfilled the contract.
Thank you. Could we have Anna next, please?
So Checkpoint Cymru has been in situ since the tail end of 2019, keen to mirror the Durham model, but also at the time I was having conversations with our panel member Sarah to see how Devon and Cornwall were running theirs, which was hugely helpful, really. So in terms of what we do up here, not a million miles away, which will come as no great surprise to you, as what they do in Devon and Cornwall, and obviously the original Durham model. So we have police staff who work as navigators, who are based within police settings, so police stations and custody settings. Those referrals will come from the officers to a specific allocated pot, and then the navigators will then assess for eligibility criteria and such like. Anything that's nuanced or slightly complex will get passed on to the senior navigator, and ultimately to me if there's query around it, really. So we were impacted by a pandemic when we went live, which kind of set us back slightly, because obviously it's people that make things work. Processes and pathways are all very well, but actually it's those personal relationships that you need. So that was difficult for us, but we rode the storm, and I'm pleased to say that we've been going from strength to strength year on year. So I can tell you more about it as we go through the questions.
Excellent. And Katie, please.
Thank you. So the Met has not actually offered deferred prosecution as an available outcome, but it did allow a trial of deferred prosecution in 3 London boroughs as an RCT in Barnet, Brent and Harrow, and that was for adults and youth. And we were trying to replicate the Turning Point Birmingham test of deferred prosecution, but using some of a lot of the learning from Checkpoint Durham. For example, we used their needs assessment and some of their approaches to interventions. We started off with a police-based model as we had no funding for staff, and we housed deferred prosecution to be managed within Yacht and IOM. We quickly found out that wasn't sustainable within our resourcing envelope, and we managed to get some funding to be able to employ 2 police staff offender managers, we called them. I wouldn't necessarily use that term now, and they supported both youth and adults. So if you were referred as a youth, you were kind of taken out of the existing Yacht system and managed by the police offender managers with Yacht's knowledge of what was going on. And if you were an adult, you were obviously managed by the offender managers. And we ran the RCT for about 2.5 years, had about 546 offenders coming through, obviously split between being given a caution or charge as normal or being offered Turning Point. So a bit like Sarah's model, we offered deferred simple caution and deferred charge as well. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Now, if I'm just going to give everybody who registered for, or who pre-registered for this webinar will have received a briefing sheet, but just a very, very quick definition of deferred prosecution, just so everyone can follow what we're talking about. It's an alternative to sending someone through the courts and into the prison system, and essentially only for certain levels of offenders, of course, where it is deemed appropriate that we can offer them something like a behavioral contract, but obviously we'll go through how every force has done it. But in essence is, rather than sending you to prison, you're going to work with us for the next 2 years. You're going to adhere to certain conditions, go to the sessions that hopefully will address the roots of your offending. You're going to fulfill all the requirements, obviously not offend in that time. And if you have stuck to those conditions for 2 years, then you will, the conviction will actually not lead to you going to prison. It will be fine. But if you do break any of the conditions, then you are going to prison. So it's hanging over you for that time, but it's giving an alternative for you to stay in the community under certain conditions, comply with certain requirements that are put onto you, and then you're kept out of the prison system. So, Matt, do you want to take over now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Right, so let's get into the meat of it. Then we're going to ask our experts some questions. The first half of this is going to be us and questions that we have dreamt up, but we very much want to use the second half of the webinar to get answers to questions that you have. So please do post them in the comments on whatever format you're watching on. And we'll pick those up as we go through, and we will put those to the panel in the second half. You can ask absolutely anything you want. We really sort of want to get to the candid take on what it takes to get this off the ground in practice, whatever the scheme looks like. And obviously just keep it clean. We will try and remove any swearing that you put in there best we can, and we will see how it goes. So I'm going to start now with the first of our questions. And Suzanne, I'd put you down for this, but I'm already talking, so I'm just going to keep going if that works for you. Katie, I'm going to put this question to you first of all, and then we will ask anybody else who wants to contribute if they have a view on it as well. I think when I normally talk about deferred prosecutions, it can sometimes be seen as sort of a soft alternative, soft policing alternative, possibly counterintuitive to what you might call a zero tolerance approach or enforcement focused. How big a cultural shift has it been for officers working on it in the Met? And what advice would you give to others about how to navigate that shift?
Thank you. So yes, initially in the adult world, I would say we had to overcome quite a big cultural jump. The idea that people could admit an offence and not get a caution for it or a prosecution for it if they undertook a series of interventions tailored to their criminogenic needs. Within the youth space, it was really uncontroversial, being brutally honest, and in fact all the partners were lobbying for this way before we did the launch. That was quite an easy win. As to whether it's a softer on crime option, in my study, we've actually compared the court outcomes for those that were eligible for charge versus the turning point contract conditions. And we've actually found that our offenders were made far more accountable for their behaviour under the deferred prosecution scheme. So they were monitored for 4 months. They had to complete rehabilitative activity or restorative action. And compared to court, where most people got a fine or some form of financial penalty, whether that's a victim surcharge, that there was no, and I say no, rehabilitative element issued from court. So this idea that court is giving a form of justice that holds people to account and addresses behaviours is a bit of a misnomer. It's not currently doing that at the magistrates' court. And I think a lot of victims of crime don't necessarily appreciate actually what very little happens at court. Yes, someone might get a criminal record and a small fine, but we know the vast majority of those fines go unpaid. And actually 20% of our sample that were offered Turning Point declined it, with many saying it required them to do too much and that they would rather be sent to court or take the caution. So that we launched Turning Point London in 2017. We didn't go live to 2018, we did the planning the year before. And now I would say that the barriers to introducing it are far less. And I've got certainly partners and lots of police officers wanting to offer it. The challenge is it is not cost neutral to policing to follow offenders for 4 months when you might have simply given them a caution before. In terms of court, it's obviously a little bit different because it saves you case papers, but that's another question. So I'm finding already that attitudes have really changed, but it still does divide opinion. But I think it's all about how you articulate what you are requiring offenders to do to be able to get their deferred prosecution, which some might argue should actually be called a conditional NFA. That seems maybe a slightly easier way of explaining the process. I don't know if anyone's got any questions in relation to that.
Have you had any pushback on the language? You say that calling it conditional NFA might be a way forward. Has that come up in circles when you're discussing this?
It's only come up very, very recently. Sarah will be aware of it. We're talking kind of nationally, how might we sort of frame deferred prosecution to become a national offer? We were in the very early stages of that. But it's actually someone in the CPS that has suggested that, which seems to make quite a lot of sense to me. And interestingly, I think we've gone through a bit of a journey with the CPS, who now I think nationally seem quite pro, as long as there is standardisation across the UK in terms of eligibility and in terms of what kind of conditions and management happens to the offender. But I do think minds are changing around whether it's a soft option or not. The question is whether you can convince, I think, the rest of the public who, for understandable reasons, aren't going to understand the nuances between the different types of outcomes that offenders receive.
Yeah. Matt, could I come in on this? Yeah,
please.
Just in terms of culture change, I remember it was Mam Hadari who said to me, I think, a wonderful statement that, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it doesn't matter how well thought out your ideas or your processes are. Officers have a lot of discretion in this. And so my advice would be is don't underestimate it, but don't spend so long trying to convince people who will never be convinced. Your best argument is actually making sure that you deliver and that you're getting results. And that feedback loop back to officers, and like Katie articulated, the use of stories, being able to say, actually, that person complied, this was everything that they needed to do, they're not coming back into the system, and they start to see that, is really good customer relationships management, because officers talk to other officers. And that's where you start to sort of change the internal culture. It does take time, but it's the most effective way of doing it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the public side, is pushback been greater there for any of you than it has internally, or is the public generally quite open to this as a policing solution?
Well, we ran a victim survey, sorry to jump in on there, but we ran a parallel victim survey with ours. And whilst we found that overall victim satisfaction was similar between those sent to Turning Point versus those charged or cautioned as normal, satisfaction was high on both counts, so it was well over 75% for each. But actually, the victims in deferred prosecution were way more satisfied in terms of being reassured that the offender wouldn't do it again. There was quite distinct differences around their levels of satisfaction and what they thought the programme was trying to achieve. And we braced ourselves for what we thought was going to be quite a bit of public backlash, potentially from victims whose cases were randomly assigned to deferred prosecution. And while we had to take their views into account, they couldn't exclude an offender from the programme. We actually only had one case where it was contested. And actually, when we were able to speak to that person and manage those expectations, the complaint went away. So yes, we didn't get the public negative reaction that perhaps we had expected, but we spent a lot of time explaining to victims what deferred prosecution was. So we had a victim contact team, and rather than relying on the officer in the case who would be rushed and perhaps wouldn't understand the intricacies of what deferred prosecution was trying to do, the victim contact team aimed to have a conversation with every single victim and spent some time taking them through the aims of the programme, why we were testing, what we were trying to achieve. And that appears to have gone well in terms of reassuring people that A, it wasn't soft, and B, it was preventing another victim of crime. And we know from other victim surveys, what victims want to hear is that this won't happen to somebody else. And I think we need to make sure in deferred prosecution schemes there is parity between the victim and offender experience. And I think in police criminal justice processes, it becomes very easy just to focus on the offender. And I think if we do that, then we do risk a lack of public trust in what we're trying to do.
Can I just repeat? Sorry.
So I just want to move on to the next question. Do you have something quick to add to this one?
All I was going to say was, I think the biggest sort of challenge for internally for us is that detection is obviously it's a positive outcome, whereas deferred prosecution for us is outcome 22, which is not recognised nationally as positive. And I think when officers are asked to deliver against KPIs, that's when you've got a difficulty. And in terms of victims, just to reiterate what Sarah was saying, really, is that it's that public relations, and it's explaining to people that actually it's much more difficult for somebody to comply with something and bear their soul for 4 months than to go to court.
Thank you. So we've spoken about how to get victims on board. Now, Sarah, can I address this next question to you? And then to the others as well, but let's start with you. How do you get the partners on board in a meaningful and sustainable way?
Yeah, so talking from our experience and to give some sort of practical tips, I would say it's really important to feel confident about getting partners engaged and talking to them right from the beginning. So there is a tendency sometimes that we think about the partnerships as an afterthought, and they are vitally important. So don't approach them, I would say, in a really hierarchical fashion. If you talk particularly to people in the third sector, sometimes they feel a bit done to. And that policing comes along and says, well, we'll signpost to you or we'll refer to you. And actually what this should be is about all working together, because undoubtedly the people that are coming into services, whether other statutory services or voluntary sector, are the same people. And if you have those market engagements, if you have those open conversations and you have a rallying cry, which is very much about what do we all agree on, what do we all want? And what we all want is to reduce harm, to make our communities safer, then that brings everyone together in the room to try and say, okay, this is what we're thinking about deferred prosecution. Let's have a really open discussion to try and problem solve and think about the ideas about how we can work together. And that, for us, really harnessed a partnership, because we don't really commission services. We have our key workers acting as kind of the lead professionals, if there aren't others that are already involved in people's lives, and then linking in to the community assets that exist within Devon and Cornwall. And that for us is really important, because we've got 4 months. And actually, we want really clear exit strategies that people are embedded in support within their communities. So engage, have honest conversations, do it in a collaborative way, do it in a real proper ethical partnership way that isn't being about done to. Make sure then you're linking in with your infrastructure organisation, so your VCS infrastructure, knowing what's out there, who's doing what, that already exists that you can tap into. Use the existing structures you have in terms of your strategic boards, your relationships with community safety partnerships. Tap into those and tap into your OPCCs. Understand and have conversations with the local authority commissioners, because there are existing contracts with statutory providers, often with an element of criminal justice within there, that you can actually exploit, get in, make sure that there's almost a fast tracking of people coming through deferred prosecution. And build those relationships, both from your lead for out of court resolutions or wherever that might be, in terms of those strategic kind of discussions of how we can work together. But also, if you're lucky enough to be trying to think of a team or getting a commissioned service, make sure you're doing that outreach and that brokerage and that relationship building, because a lot of this, whether it's about partnerships or whether it's about the offenders we work with or the victims that we liaise with, it's all about relationships. And so from there, building the sustainability, make sure, as I said, if you can get into those contracts, you do build operational MOIs and understandings between different statutory partners. At the same time, we hold regular partnership events, and I'll put a picture into the comments in a bit. And that's a real opportunity where we're sharing information about policing generally, but also about the performance data and what we're seeing from our deferred prosecution, at the same time as our partners, of which there are many, coming together in a really, I've got to say, jolly atmosphere. Our last one was at Theatre Royal, who are in Plymouth, who are a brilliant partnership of ours in their R Space programme. And people who'd gone through the programme sharing their testimonials. And what we do is do a certificate of appreciation. And that's really important. You know, people want to just be appreciated for the work that they're doing and feel that they're in a proper partnership around it. And that's what we try and do in terms of our approach. And it's something which brings me, and I'm sure Emily will concur, a lot of pleasure and joy in working with that wider partnership.
I'll just add onto that as well. I think just to echo what Sarah said, I think it's about having those relationships at a strategic level and understanding the very localized pictures. In Devon and Cornwall, we've got some really, really small community organisations that we work with, and they work in a few towns, but they're really vital to those people in those areas, and they're often areas of high need as well. So we use and rely on them a lot. And then drawing down those strategic relationships to kind of really good one-to-one relationships with those people locally, which we're able to do through our key worker model, and reflect those throughout the year. So I think that's really important. It's not just at the strategic level, but it's also on the ground as well, and drawing down from there.
Would anyone else like to jump in on that question before we move on to the next one? Anna, thank you.
If you don't mind, yeah, thank you. I think what's sort of been really helpful for us is that the team of navigators that we've got come from a lot of the partner agencies in North Wales anyway, be it criminal justice system or outside of that. So they bring with them an absolute wealth of knowledge and skill set and experience. But in addition to that, it's effectively they're bringing their own little black book, if you like, in the sense of contacts, relationships that are already established out there. And actually, going back to my opening point, it's those relationships with people that make things work, good or bad, effectively. So when we started, we were very lucky that we already had established relationships through our own previous work. But I can't stress really enough how much it is how important it is to take people on the journey with you in partner agencies, and particularly third sector. I came from third sector, and they do an awful lot for very little. And I think that it's really important to at least give them a platform to be heard when we're working collaboratively.
You know, I work in the third sector now, so I can totally resonate with me. You're doing a lot for very little. That's my life. Really important part of the process is the referral process into the schemes. I know that's a really key link in the chain. Anna, could you just tell us a bit more about how you fine-tuned that process?
So our referral process mirrored a lot of what Durham does. In the sense that we work with adults, and obviously we follow the gravity matrix around out of court disposals, soon to be out of court resolutions, if that goes ahead as is expected to. So in terms of referral pathways for us, and actually this is linked into that project initiation document, your implementation, your project management initially. There are things within a policing service, policing systems, that isn't designed for a deferred prosecution scheme, because you're bringing that softer stuff, the fluffy stuff, as they say, into policing. So I think policing is generally quite black and white, and we're essentially that shade of grey in the middle. So what I'd say is make sure that you're absolutely clear around your referrals and your pathways. So there was a little bit of a pragmatic approach initially, so that we could test the waters to see what was coming through and what wasn't. I think the difficulties that you'll find is that some offences that have domestic element weren't always clear cut, and there would be other jobs, offences that weren't quite so clear cut. And that's when you really need to be quite open-minded to looking at the individuals that are coming through. And it's like I say to CPS quite often when we do the scrutiny panel meetings, is that we shouldn't just be looking at that job, we should be looking at the person and holistically what's going on for them, rather than that specific job, because there could be pieces of a jigsaw that's missing if you're only looking at that one particular area. So for us, it was quite important that we had a structured set of criteria, and that we were able to stick to it, with the caveat that we had that flexibility where needed to, because of obviously starting something completely new and completely different in North Wales, so that we could take on board officers' views, the individuals that we're supporting, so that we weren't penalising anyone unnecessarily, and that victims were also clear around what it is we were trying to achieve. So referrals can be quite tricky, because at the end of the day, we're working with human beings, and nothing is ever clear-cut with human beings. So we've got to make sure that we take each job on its own merit within the confines of our criteria. And for us, it's 18 and over, living in North Wales, offended in North Wales, not domestic related, and there's a few other things. But we've been quite lucky in North Wales that when it comes to hate crime, we originally had an agreement with the CPS hate crime lead in Wales, whereby those that would have been suitable for a CR as opposed to a charge were referred to us, and we would pick up the conversation with CPS around whether we thought it would be eligible or suitable rather for deferred prosecution. The situation by now is that because we were quite clear around the ask from CPS when we were assessing these jobs, we've used their criteria essentially, or their guidance, to continue that now. So deferred prosecution, obviously being at the force's risk, we take that risk, but we have consistency around how we assess those jobs, and actually it works well. So I think, as I say, the referral route, it is about set criteria and being quite clear about what your criteria is, but you do need to have that flexibility within.
That's awesome. Emily, in Devon and Cornwall, I know you're very close to the referral process. What does it still give you any headaches, or has it ever given you headaches, and how have you got past those?
Yeah, I think inevitably there's always people and circumstances that don't quite fit in the boxes that you've created. And I think what Anna's saying about that criteria being quite broad is important. I think obviously we've got red lines and people we can't take and national guidance, etc. But I think we've kept it as broad as we can, because it also acts to kind of counteract some of the cultural barriers as well. So we're trying to screen people in initially, and then we can kind of along the lines we can screen them out if they're then not eligible. But it helps with that culture change for officers to be able to refer as many people as possible, so we're not always saying no. So that's definitely helped. In Devon and Cornwall as well, more recently, we've got a specialised hub of evidence review officers for out-of-court resolutions. And that's helped with consistency and is helping with consistency, because they're a small group of specially trained officers who are always doing those out-of-court resolutions jobs. So they're building up their knowledge, and they're a place where other officers, other gatekeepers can come to for advice as well. So some of the headaches that we had before around some consistency issues, kind of rationale and recording, eligibility criteria not being applied, etc., and a lot of that burden being put on the key worker in Devon and Cornwall who need the time to be seeing people face to face, has been taken by those specialist review officers. So that's really helped, and we've been quite lucky in terms of resourcing for that. But it's something that I think has made quite a lot of difference, and build our confidence in knowing that people who we are accepting and working with are eligible and appropriate.
Awesome.
And I'm probably just stepping in very, very quickly, because I know we've got to move on, but just probably stepping into a different area around learning. But when we talk about referral process, when we started, it was a referral form that an officer was meant to fill in at 3 o'clock in the morning, saying this person might be suitable for deferred prosecution. Do not do that. It was very clear it didn't work right from the beginning. You have to use the systems. You have to integrate this in a CJ process. You have to take any additional work, and even reduce, if you can, any work on officers, and use the processes so that it is easy and accessible and causes them no more time. And then you can actually move it to generate the kind of making sure that the eligibility criteria is absolutely consistently applied through things like specialist EROs, for example.
That's great advice. I can see everybody sort of nodding along at the same time. That experience obviously really resonates. Suzanne, your question.
Yes. So what performance or management information do you think needs to be tracked to ensure schemes are on course? And can we have Emily first and then move along?
Yeah, so I think we were all kind of always asking for and being asked for, lots of different data, performance analysis, etc. And it's sometimes hard to get those. And I think it's important to set up what you're trying to find out first of all. I think there's kind of 3 areas that you can more easily collect data to tell you about. I think one is about that culture change. So to collect data along the way will tell you about how many eligible cases are being referred compared to how many there actually are. So I think if you can collect that data, that tells you a lot about that culture change and from where and who needs to be targeted around that, just to get your numbers in the first instance. And then obviously there's kind of your hard success kind of data about how many people have come in, how many people have successfully completed their deferred prosecution, how many have breached and why, and obviously reoffending data onwards from that. Devon and Cornwall have been lucky to have a lot of academic support with, especially with the reoffending data from SEBP, but also from elsewhere. So that's been really important, and that's really makes the argument then kind of to senior leaders about why we're doing this and what difference it makes. And using the national evidence base about cost savings, a recent studies showing that as well. So using that and using that up-to-date evidence from elsewhere. Probably similar to a lot of forces, performance and analysis in Devon and Cornwall are very stretched, and they provide us with kind of internal data that we can share. But it's really important to draw on other things that are going on elsewhere, I think, as well. And then the softer data around case studies and feedback surveys, which we offer to everybody who goes through our program, as well as victims, is really important. You can draw so much from that, and they're really important for different audiences. So for partners, some officers, some senior leaders respond really well to data. Some respond really well to personal stories and the impact that it has, and they're really invaluable. So don't underestimate, I think, the value of kind of qualitative data. And something else we do quite a lot of is around kind of, because we have those one-to-ones in interactions, and key workers kind of case manage and case hold a lot of risk, and they do a lot of interventions themselves, is we put a lot of time into kind of case supervision and reflective practice, learning and development gaps, and identifying them and trying to fill them where we can, sometimes internally, sometimes with our partners. So I think that's really important part of that as well, to show that you're kind of progressing, you're managing those risks, and ultimately, hopefully, having a positive impact on reoffending down the line. So I think not to underestimate those aspects of it as well, and take your eye off while you're trying to provide the quantitative stuff.
Could I come in here too, Matt? Would that be all right? Super, thank you. So one thing that we felt was really important to monitor, yes, it was part of an RCT, but was all cases that should have been eligible against those cases that went through. And we found that despite having a dedicated team on the ground aligned to ERO officers, we still had 45% of eligible cases that were never sent into deferred prosecution. And that is a problem from a point of view of securing fairness, consistency, and there is an impact on potentially on disproportionality there too. So you always want to see the shadow side, and I think that is a bit of a challenge in terms of how we manage current reviews of out-of-court resolutions, because we don't look at cases that perhaps could have had an out-of-court, we only look at cases that got sent to out-of-court. So that was one performance measure we had. We also had another one which was looking at how officers who were allowed to exclude eligible people from the trial, how they did that, and providing feedback to those for whom exclusion actually was a bit of a moral judgment as opposed to an evidence-based judgment. So in our eligibility screening process, we had an override that allowed for very set criteria to be applied. For example, an intelligence case. For example, we had a case where one of the most prominent burglars who hadn't been prosecuted was taken out of Turning Point because actually we needed judicial controls on that person. But we had people for whom it was very clear that certain sergeants found weren't deserving of deferred prosecution, and we made sure we had a feedback loop to address those kind of concerns. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to do one more question, and then we're going to go to questions that you have been posting. So you've still got time to put those in. I'm going to just ask every member of the panel to give us in turn their must-dos for other departments you have to work very closely with and keep in the loop when it comes to trying to do a deferred prosecution scheme. Just one or two words each on those departments and what extent of bribery is required to keep them sweet. Anna, let's go with you first, please.
It's only because I laughed at your last comment, isn't it, that you come to me first? Okay, so what I would say is, for us, it's really important that we have a very strong relationship with Justice Services, because if there's any nuances or queries around appropriate referrals, you really need to make sure you've got them on board as part of their wider remit of out-of-court disposals resolutions. There's no bribery involved, I'm pleased to say, other than maybe the odd few cakes. But I have a good working relationship with one of the managers in the team and the head of service. So that all goes to the good. I also think that you need to have very good relationships with your district inspectors, so that there's conversations that are had then with sergeants and rotors, and they kind of go without saying, really. And for us, because we are so heavily invested by the OPCC, it's obviously making sure that they're quite clear about what it is we're achieving, what the challenges are, what the hurdles are, having very honest conversations. There is a danger that people want to shine a light on everything and everything being perfect, when maybe that isn't the reality. And I think that the more honest you are with any department, the better, because they will appreciate the honesty and understand what the challenges are. And then when there are wins, they'll appreciate the wins even more. And there are many wins. There are very, very many wins, to be fair.
That's great. Katie.
Thanks. So for me, it's about ensuring you have a mandated eligibility screening process for all out-of-court resolutions and charge. Going back to the point I made earlier, to ensure there's fairness, that everyone is being considered for a criminal justice outcome in the same way against a clear threshold of criteria. There's no good just having an eligibility process just for deferred prosecution on its own, because you will have hidden effects, and you need to make sure that that whole escalator of out-of-court resolution and charging options that are available to police and CPS are followed consistently, and you're monitoring how that's done well. So for me, within the Met, that was about lobbying for a change of business processes around how EROs fundamentally approach their job. We haven't nailed that, but that's certainly something we're looking at currently. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. And Sarah, Emily, I'm going to ask one of you for the Devon and Cornwall view. So I'll let you two duke it out as to which one of you wants to give that view.
Well, she knows that I'm going to come in because I'm terrible at interrupting and taking the stage. So sorry, Emily, I'm going to do it. For me, it's very important, probably bleeding into really what you have to think about is do get your senior leaders on board. It's very easy to agree that in a paper that they might be supportive, but it's another thing to actually really put pen to paper, mandate that people should be looking at this. So find out your allies in the exec and use them, and don't spend time trying to convince your detractors. And then from there, don't leave IT systems. They're the people that you really need to have on board. With massive backlogs in terms of prioritisation for changes, do have an inroad. Anna's suggestion about cake seems to work down here as well, or maybe it would be cream teas down here, I'm not too sure. And also P&A. I was being asked right from the beginning, probably by the detractors, can you prove your reduction in reoffending? And I think I've been going for 6 weeks by then. But you do need to have those really good links with P&A, so that you are making sure that at any point you are asked for data, whether that be quantitative or qualitative, you can turn on a sixpence and produce it.
Sorry, what is P&A?
I was going to say, I think we need to get an acronym buzzer for
sorry, performance and analysis. So your analysts, yeah.
Brilliant. All right, that's great. Thank you ever so much. That I think that's all of the preloaded questions, although we've got one that I might finish on later on. Suzanne, are you ready to run through the questions that viewers have been putting into the list, please?
Right, so we've got a question from Diggy Richard. So the first one is, you said there was a positive impact on public views and expectations when people were included in the deferred prosecution team. Is there not a risk that this additional attention from the team has created a different level of victim engagement when compared to more normal disposal? I know officers don't explain well often.
Absolutely, completely. But we would say if you were wanting to run out-of-court resolutions well, you would be wanting to invest that time with the victim. So yes, the positive effect might be because you spent more time with the victim, but the whole programme was looking at the victim and offender experience. So yes, and no surprise really, but actually it was very hard to manage the reliability of those conversations being done well. Initially we wanted the officers in the case to do it, but we found there was just too much diversity of explanations. A lot of people had their own personal views slipping in. Some people thought, oh, we're just doing this for cost cutting, and would tell the victim that. So in the end, we had this formed a dedicated team and use scripting prompts to help people have a really quality conversation.
And can I just add, I think that dedicated team is really important. I think you could train and train and train, but you will always get those variables in terms of quality and consistency. Our team take on those conversations. They're the ones that explain it. They're the ones that liaise with the victims, etc. And I think that's critical to success.
And I think very helpfully, that point has been picked up by the MPCC lead for our court resolutions in the preparation for the two-tier framework. And when you look at the bronze, silver and gold standards that are being developed for forces to try and meet the level of expectation required, you will see that the learning from all the schemes that are on this core and checkpoint have really fed into that. So we're actually hoping that the experience of testing deferred prosecution will improve the quality of interventions for all out-of-court resolutions moving forward under two-tier. That's the hope anyway.
I would also just add to that quickly, if I may. Even though officers might have those initial conversations with the victim around the offender's been referred to checkpoint, which is obviously important for them to know at that point, what we need to consider is they are going to be recently victims of crime and may not always take on board what is said to them. And if they have a very distinct sort of perception of what they see as justice, they may put it to one side, which is why it's really key that our team of navigators then pick up that mantle and have those conversations with the victim once the referrals come through in a more controlled environment where potentially the dust has settled slightly, to allow them to fully understand what we're trying to achieve and the benefits to them as well as the offender.
Great, thank you.
I'm sorry, Suzanne, I know we move on, but just to add, it sits alongside this, but when we're working with offenders, the offender-victim overlap is so huge. And so we know that many of those offenders are also victims, future victims or past victims. And so the work that we do as well is also about, improving confidence and relationships with the police, and seeing that actually we do want to reduce reoffending, reduce crime, protect communities as a whole. So we're also, when we're working with the offenders, we're also that they are victims in a lot of other circumstances. So I think that really makes a difference, and we see lots of disclosures and intelligence that we wouldn't have got before. So I think that part of the victim relationship can't be overlooked as well.
Excellent, thank you. Next one is from Smiling Cat, who's watching on YouTube. Sounds interesting. Working in victim services, court outcomes are length of time it takes to get court can have a detrimental impact on the victim's mental health. Sentencing is not seen as enough. And the question is, how successful is this scheme on preventing reoffending? Is there any element of restorative justice with the victim?
So I'll take some of those elements. It's a really good question, and thank you for it. So yes, the language around out-of-court resolutions and how we speak to both people who've offended and victims is really critical, and that ties into, this is about accessing swift justice. This isn't about softer justice. And as part of the whole suite of sort of tools in our box, really, promoting restorative justice is really critical to that. And it's really easy if RJ, say at the front end by an officer, oh, are you interested in restorative justice? What's that? Oh, it's when I think you sit down with the offender. No wonder people kind of dismiss it. Whereas obviously, again, coming back to the dedicated team, those conversations are much better handled, are conversations, are a process throughout the 4 months, and really help with the conversion. Because as we know, a lot of people can get the things that they want, that they require, the compensation, which we can set up really quickly compared to often the court process. We can make sure through our VCOP compliance that we're telling them if they want to know what are the kind of compliance with conditions that the offender's doing. But often they're left with kind of wondering why me? And we know that RJ is something which can really help answer some of those questions across the spectrum of what they might want in terms of whether that be shuttle mediation, letters, etc. And we think we bring the consistency and quality to that. So it's really important. In terms of our levels of reducing reoffending, I'll let Emily answer that. Thank you.
Yeah, so recently, so thanks to Matt and SEBP, we've been able to look at the reoffending rates following deferred charge, which shows that deferred charges compared to those who were eligible but opted out, it halves the reoffending rates. So that's obviously really positive for us, and that helps again with feeding back to senior leaders, in terms of keeping this, resourcing this, and hopefully we'll support kind of nationally other places that want to look into deferred as well.
Thanks. Could I chip in on this? Firstly, to address the length of time it takes cases to get to court versus being dealt with in deferred prosecution. So in our trial in London, I appreciate it's a few years ago now, actually turning point cases took slightly longer to resolve, but that was to the completion of a contract. Actually, it was much quicker for victims to get an outcome and for the offender to start being held accountable and waiting for court. In terms of reoffending outcomes, actually it's quite nuanced, and it kind of depends on the type of offence and especially the age of the offender being referred into the programme. So in our trial, we randomised according to whether a person was a youth offender transitioning to adults at 18 to 21 and then people over 22. And whilst we found that there is a reduction in the over 22s, this is following a 2-year follow-up, this is very long-term effects. So no effect on whether they reoffended or not, yes or no, so a binary answer, but it did reduce frequency of reoffending and the nature of the harm, that definitely came down. Our sample sizes for youth and 18 to 21s are much smaller. So we have to be a little bit careful about drawing too strong conclusions around that. But for the 18 to 21 group, they were in the control group, they were 3 times more likely to reoffend if they were sent to court or caution as usual. And that is statistically significant, but the sample size is still quite small. So again, that caution is key. And for youth offenders, we had a null result. Now that's possibly because youth in the control group, so getting their caution as usual charge, were already being supported by yachts. But we also had 3 very, very prolific young offenders, the worst 3 in the trial, that happened to be randomised into the treatment arm of the youth cohort. And again, because our sample was quite small, it would be interesting to see what those results would be if we took the outliers out. But there are methodological issues with that. But it certainly looked quite promising anyway.
Thank you. I've got a question here from Diggy Richard. Does any difference in reoffending take into account potential differences in the speed of the outcome if deferred prosecution is faster?
We were never able to measure that. So our reoffending analysis uses a regression analysis. So it actually controls for certain things. So we controlled for the age of the offender, the gender, ethnicity, and whether they had previous offending or not. And we actually found that having previous offending was the most, unsurprisingly, predictive variable about future reoffending, regardless of whether you were sent to deferred prosecution or not. But we didn't have a mechanism for the speed in which cases were resolved to try and check that as an indicator of effectiveness or likely effectiveness. But actually the premise from the start was that our scheme had to be really quick. So it was initiated within 24 to 48 hours after being told that there was an evidential and public interest test against the offender. So speed was absolutely everything.
Can I jump in quickly? Sorry. Just to agree really in that I think what's really important that we found up here is the geography of North Wales, a bit like Devon, Cornwall. The contact details may not be up to date, and you could be scrambling through forests looking for people or on top of a mountain. So what's really important is that those details were up to date so that we could get hold of people quickly. The longer it took to get hold of people, the more likely they are to either not engage or to disengage. So that's absolutely vital. So yes, you do need to make sure that you can get hold of people quickly.
And just one other thing to notice, that we found that those that didn't engage very early on were those far more likely to reoffend. So we kind of knew from the outset whether someone was kind of open to do deferred prosecution, whether they were likely to be successful on it. So that was quite an interesting perspective that I would like to probe more in some of the further analysis.
Okay, then probably our last question for today from Ethan from the National Crime Agency. The use of conditional cautions to access deferred prosecution programs could create opportunity bias for communities with low trust in the police. A conditional no further action approach might negatively impact performance metrics, and therefore senior stakeholder support. Could outcome 22 be a viable compromise between conditional caution and conditional no further action, even if not universally seen positively by all forces? Or could the panel advocate for one or the other recording mechanisms?
So I know Katie will desperately want to come in, but can I just pick up a point which I think is really important, is that this work sits in early intervention and it sticks in prevention. And the first PDM principle is to prevent crime. The evidence base is compelling. I mean, it might be limited, but it's certainly growing. And I think we've got to sometimes in policing really be brave and say, is this the right thing to do? Is this actually something which is reducing harm and reducing reoffending? And to some extent, stick to that, regardless of counting rules, etc. I think, we've got to say that actually the opportunity to intervene early, to understand who are going to be our high harmers through a process of really engaging with them at that early stage, makes total sense, rather than spending money at the back end of the criminal justice system, which we don't seem to question. So for me, it's about those principles as well, and it's the right thing to do in terms of reducing harm.
But Sarah, in terms of being able to persuade a chief officer to adopt deferred prosecution, those challenges raised by the questioner are very valid. And actually, it is policing themselves that have generated this idea that outcome 22 is not a positive case disposal. Forced crime registrars up and down the country are quite frustrated at this because actually it's a recognised counting outcome, and HMIC have endorsed forces that use it for diversion in a very positive way. But the Home Office are currently reviewing outcome 22 and it's linked to deferred prosecution and out of court, and I think there is probably going to be an acceptance that we will see a separate outcome in terms of Home Office counting rules coming in for deferred schemes, so we can very clearly differentiate between what's community resolution, what is one of the two-tier framework cautions, and what's deferred prosecution. And there is work to look at how do we create an escalator process through which it's very clear to the police and the public how people move up the different severity levels of out of court in a fair way and in a way that makes logical sense. But that work is still ongoing.
Thank you very much. I think that's all the questions we can take in this live session. I am volunteering the panel if there's so there's a number of people watching live, of course, but this video will stay up, especially on YouTube. It'll be easier to find than on LinkedIn and some other platforms where it'll be buried with newsfeed. So if you've got more questions, post them there, and maybe if the panel is generous enough, once in a while they can check in and just see if there's any other questions they can answer in the comments. Over to you, Matt.
Okay, thank you. Look, I just need to say a huge thanks to our panelists for the generosity of their time and giving their expertise so that others might be able to pick up some really interesting bits of information taking this sort of scheme forward. What we will do after this event, obviously, as Susanna said, is it will remain live. We'll put it on the website, but for everybody who's registered, you will receive a summary of the notes from this meeting. So you've got some actionable points to take away. We really hope you enjoyed it. Please give us your feedback. The next session that we're running will be on Valentine's Day. So we will have a different theme. We'll be looking at proactive interventions into violence against women and girls with several speakers from Project Vigilant and other projects of that nature. We hope to see you there. But thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.